So tonight, we're going to talk about the Genesis flood, a global catastrophe. Ken Ham, with the Answers in Genesis, he's the one that just built this museum up in Kentucky. By the way, I've been up there. It's a fantastic museum. Got all kinds of great exhibits there, and very, very consistent with the Word of God there, as you'd expect Ken Ham and Answers in Genesis to be. But Ken Ham used to teach the children when he'd talk about creation science and things like that. He'd say, you know, if there was a great flood, you'd expect to find billions of dead things buried in rock layers, laid down by water all over the earth. And what do we find when we look into the geological record? Billions of dead things buried in rock layers, laid down by water all over the earth. This is the very evidence that we find when we look into the road cuts and so forth. And of course, they are sedimentary rock layers all over the world, witnessed by anytime you drive through the mountains or the road cuts, you're going to see these layers of rock. What caused those to be there? I'll tell you some interesting things about what the geologists say how they came to be. But let's take a tour around the world, though. I'm going to show you some pictures here. Here's one from Tennessee. Driving through the Great Smoky Mountains, you can see the layers of rock. These up vertical stripes are where they drilled down, and then the horizontal layers and so forth, how all that was laid down. In Tennessee there, as we move around the world, we'll end up in Ireland, and you can see on the face of this cliff right here, the rock layers all the way down like this. And so you see it in the United States, you see it in Ireland. Moving over to Switzerland now, even in these high mountains of Switzerland, you can see the vast rock layers coming across there. And in Sicily, that little island off of the boot of Italy, you can see on this cliff the layers of rocks. So moving our way around the world here, going across the Adriatic Sea to Greece, you can see this little monastery built into this side of this escarpment right here, all the layers of rock around that. And I just searched the internet and just found pictures that did this, showed these layers. Moving even over to Tibet, where the Himalayas are and so forth. Look on this left side. This is an old black and white picture, but you can see even within this left side of these rock layers right here, these striations indicating the layers there in those Tibetan mountains. And even at the top of the Himalayas, you can see these layers of rock all the way up to the very tip top here. I was in Hawaii earlier this year in January, took a family vacation over there, and we went to the island of Kauai, and there is a small canyon on that island, and we flew over it with a helicopter, and I took this picture. And even in that canyon, in the island of Hawaii, you can see these layers, rock layers all over there. And
is that canyon a result of a flood?
It's laid down by water, absolutely. Laid down by rock layers laid down by water, and you can find fossils in every one of those layers out there like that. So we're going to talk about the Grand Canyon. That's a tremendous monument to a catastrophe right here in our United States. But here's Utah. This is Bryce Canyon in Utah. And you can see the layers, even amongst these little spires. Incredible geological formations like this. And so these layers are a very common thing across the entire surface of the earth like that. And each layer is supposed to be a geological age. It's supposed to be the lower layers being much longer ago, billions of years ago, and the top layers being more recent. And within these layers that they find fossils, they call them index fossils because you find certain types of fossils in one layer and another type of fossil in another layer. And so the fossils are sort of graded in different layers like that. And when they find a particular type of fossil in this layer, they make a guess as to how old or when that fossil came to be. As a matter of fact, it's kind of funny because the paleontologists, the ones that looks at the fossils, they want to find out how old that fossil is, so they go ask the rock guys, the geologist, and say, how old is this layer? And the rock guy says, well, it's so many billions of years old. And then when the geologist tries to find out how old this particular layer is, he goes ask the paleontologist, well, how old is this fossil I found in this rock layer? And he says, well, it's so many billions of years old. So they have this circular reference to each other, and neither one really knows when it is, because you can't, we talked last week about dating rocks, remember? You can't date sedimentary rocks. Sedimentary rocks have no known dating method, so there is no date on these fossils within those rocks. That's an interesting thought right there. But scientists, of course, scoff at a global flood, and yet they have to explain all of this geology without a global flood. And they have this idea of uniformitarianism. Remember the verse in 2 Peter that says, all things continue as it was from the beginning. This is the uniformitarian science. This is Charles Lyell came out with this idea back during Darwin's time, and says that, the key to the past is the present. Whatever's happening today is the way it's always been happening. And so if it's building up very slowly today, it must have been building up slowly like that for millions and billions of years. And so this is how they explain that. Now, uniformitarianism admits that there were floods. In fact, they say that all these rock layers were buried by water, by floods. And so they admit that the only way you can lay out all these rock layers like that is with water deposits. But they don't suggest that it was a global flood. They suggest a lot of little local floods is the way they come about that. And so because heaven forbid that you speak of a global flood, because then you're agreeing with the Bible, and they certainly don't want to do that. So they talk about lots of local floods. Now, if the rock layers were formed rapidly by a flood, and that's where all the fossils are, then where do you put all the billions of years that the evolutionists require for their evolution? So that's the problem they have. And so they don't want it to be a global flood for that reason. Now, like I said, they admit that every part of the earth was covered with water at one point in time. In fact, you can go up to the top of Mount Everest and find fossils of ocean seagoing type animals and shells and things like that at the top of these giant mountains. And how did that get there? Well, it was underwater at some point. But they suggest that that this all happened at different times by different ages that happened on the earth, as opposed to one global type of catastrophe as the Bible would tell us to be. Now, they believe in catastrophic things. They talk about uniformitarianism in a big way. But you know what? You can see catastrophic events like this headline that was in some science journal, giant meteors cause dinosaur extinction. And so that would be a great catastrophic event. See, they hadn't figured out why dinosaurs are no longer here, so they got to come up with some kind of way. We'll talk about dinosaurs in a couple of weeks. But they believe in catastrophic events when it comes to that, but they dare not talk about catastrophic events when it comes to the geologic record, because that would be admitting, of course, the flood. So what are, from our perspective, from a Christian's perspective, if you're going to believe in a global worldwide flood as a judgment that God made upon the earth because of what you read in Genesis chapter 6 and 7, what are the evidences for a global worldwide flood besides the road cuts and so forth? We'll talk about those again too. But the first thing we need to do, though, is look at the biblical evidence, because God's Word has a lot to say about a flood. In fact, all the mountains were covered, it says, for 5 months period of time. Now, in Genesis chapter 7, verses 17 through 20, it says, "Now the flood was on the earth for 40 days. The waters increased and lifted up the ark. And then it rose high above the earth, and the waters prevailed and greatly increased on the earth. And the ark was moved about on the surface of the waters, and the waters prevailed exceedingly on the earth. And all the high hills under the whole heaven were covered. The waters prevailed 15 cubits upward, and the mountains were covered." In other words, the mountains were covered by 15 cubits of water, all the high mountains that are up there. Now, in the Hebrew, when it talks about the waters prevailed, there's an adjective in there. And in the English, we have to say greatly increased, prevailed exceedingly over the earth, and the waters increased and so forth. But in the Hebrew, it's the same adjective all three different times, but the way they make it stronger, like, we say good, better, best, the way the Hebrew works is it says prevailed one time to mean it prevailed, and then double it, prevailed. They double the adjective like that in order to make it bigger, and then they triple it to make it a superlative like that, and that's tripled. The waters prevailed exceedingly on the earth. That's the tripled word for the waters increasing like that. And so it's the most superlative you can get in the Hebrew language. When the Bible talks about a holy God, it says holy, holy, holy. So it's even in the English right there. The thrice holy God it talks about. And so that's the way the Hebrew does that. And so the Hebrew means to say that this was a great, great worldwide flood, and you cannot read that scripture in any other way. And so you've got an ark. God asked Noah to build an ark. And so how is it that God would, why would God ask Noah to build such a big ark? I mean, we're going to see the dimensions of that ark in just a minute. By the way, he gave Noah 120 years to build this ark. He said there's going to be a flood, and it didn't come for another 120 years. So Noah had 120 years to build this ark, okay? And it wasn't just for only the purpose of building the ark. He had 120 years because the Bible says Noah was a preacher of righteousness, we find out in Peter. And so Noah was preaching to the lost people, giving them a warning, because God never judges without giving a warning first. And so Noah was preaching for 120 years. He's the only preacher I know of that never had a single soul saved except those in his family. Okay? But at the same time, he was building that ark. Now, if it had been a local flood, if God was only going to flood the local area, which way a lot of Christians who believe in long ages, that's what they have to believe in, is in a local flood, because otherwise, where do you put all those rock layers if they came out about over millions of years? So this local flood, Noah in 120 years could have walked around the earth 4 or 5 times. He could have fled to high ground in that period of time. He wouldn't need to build an ark in order to float and to escape the judgment that came as a result of that flood for 120 years. He could have just walked away, no problem. And so, and the Bible talks about all the air-breathing animals being killed. And so, and uses words like the Hebrew word for the flood is mabul, which is a great cataclysmic idea of a flood. And the Greek in the Septuagint, it talks about cataclysmos. That's where we get our word cataclysm from. It wasn't a mere local event like that. And so also in Genesis chapter 7:21, reading on here, it says, "And all flesh died that moved over the earth, birds and cattle and beasts and every creeping thing that creeps on the earth, and every man, all in whose nostrils was the breath of the Spirit of life, all that was on the dry land died. And so he destroyed all living things that were on the face of the ground, both man and cattle, creeping thing and bird of the air. They were destroyed from the earth. Only Noah and those who were with him in the ark remained alive. And the waters prevailed on the earth 150 days. In other words, they increased upwards for 150 days like that until they began receding like that. And we'll look at the calendar in just a minute. But you know what? What did God do at the end of this flood? After he had judged the world with this flood, and when Noah's ark came to rest like that, what did God promise he would never do again? He'd never destroy the earth again by water like that. And so how did he give a sign of that? By the rainbow. Now, by the way, do we still see rainbows? Oh yeah, we see one, probably will be one at the end of this rainy season we have right here. Rainbows always occur at the edge of the weather like that. You can always see them when the sun comes back out and things like that. And so we still see rainbows. And do we still have floods today? Yes, we do. And so if God's rainbow is out there promising he'll never send a local flood again? No, it wasn't a local flood. It had to be. We haven't had another global worldwide flood. And so his promise is only effective and only true if we haven't had a global flood, which is the way he did it. And so, and by the way, why stay on the ark for an entire year, which is how long Noah, over a year, by the way, if it was only a local flood? So the plain, obvious reading of Scripture is going to be the entire earth was devastated and all life was killed, other than those who were on the ark and other than maybe perhaps the fish and so forth. We'll talk about that in a minute. Genesis 6:13 says, "And God said to Noah, the end of all flesh has come before me, for the earth is filled with violence through them, and behold, I will destroy them with the earth." And so it wasn't just man, it was the earth that God's destroying as well. We're going to see the evidence of that in just a little while. 2 Peter says, we read this last week, so I'm going to go right down to the bottom right here. He talks about this, Everything's continued as it was from the beginning, but they forget this one thing you're ignoring, the fact that God destroyed the world that then existed. It perished, being flooded with water. And so, again, the entire Bible speaks to this final judgment, or this judgment of the flood. And later on in 2 Peter, here in this section of Scripture right here in 2 Peter 3, verse 7, it says, "But the heavens and the earth, which are now preserved by the same word," he's comparing the judgment that's future, yet future, and reserved for fire. See, the future judgment is going to be by fire. That's not a local judgment. So if the if the global flood was before, this is the global event of the future. God's final judgment will be a global, worldwide judgment, just like the original flood was. Now, while we're here in the Bible, let's make one more point here. We're going to look at the events of the flood. So the Bible gives us some interesting information about when the flood occurred, how long it happened, and so forth. And so it says, in the 600th year of Noah's life, in the 2nd month, the 17th day of the month, on that day, all the fountains of the great deep were broken up, and the windows of heaven were opened. And so the windows of heaven open up, the rain's pouring down, the fountains of the great deep open up. We'll look at that a little bit more in just a minute here, what that meant. And it all happened on the 17th day of the 2nd month. And now I know this is not a Hebrew calendar, but I want to tell you a little bit about, so I'm converting the 2nd month, which is not February in the Hebrew calendar, but I'm anglicizing it so that we'll understand a little bit more. But February 10th, Noah and his family get in the ark. And then on February 17th, the Bible tells us that the rain begins and water floods the earth for 150 days. Gives us those exact figures like that. And so at the end of 150 days, the ark comes to rest on July the 17th, and the waters begin to recede steadily. And on October the 1st, the tops of the mountains become visible again. And then on November 16th, the dove brings the olive leaf to Noah. And Noah says, okay, there must be some new growth coming out there. Everything's starting to get looking better. And Noah sends the dove out again a week later, and the dove does not return that next time after November 23rd. And so Noah figures, okay, it's safe now. You know, the dove's not returned. But God hasn't given him permission. You remember, God's the one locked him up in there. God's going to have to be the one to get him out, you know, at that point. So on January the 1st, the water had dried up from the earth, it says. And then on February 27th, they stayed on for an additional 2 months after the water had dried up, and allowed for the plant growth to start taking place, and you know, so that you're not walking out and amongst all this mud. It's starting to have a place where you can walk and stay and so forth. They leave the ark on that date, on February the 27th. So well over a year, from February 10th to February 27th, Noah and his family and all the animals that he put in there are in the flood. Now, we'll talk some more about some of those things in just a minute here, but what are the physical evidences then of a global worldwide flood? There's the biblical evidence of a global worldwide flood. Well, you know, we talked, I showed a picture the night we looked at the evidence for a young Earth. The rock layers were bent like plastic. I mean, you know, you got layers of rock that just get folded up and bent and so forth. Here's an example of that bending. This is the, well, actually, this is a different picture than I showed you before. So you see all these rock layers that were laid down flat by water. They got upended and pushed together and so forth. But as they got upended, they were bent like this. And so you see it folding these rock layers up like plastic so that it's in a soft, bendable state at some point. Water is deposited. Water-deposited layers cover the continents. We saw those pictures where these layers are common across the entire globe. And so these sedimentary rock layers are followed. You know, you can find a band. You know, like looking at a road cut or whatever. So you see a thick band that's a certain color. Well, you can go over the entire Earth, and it's that same color, that same thickness of band all across the whole Earth. You can actually trace these things. And there are huge coal and ore deposits that, by the way, aren't forming today. And you know, we're talking about running out of oil at some point in time because we're not producing any new oil. There's no oil being produced. All that oil was from all that plant life and all that animal life that was buried underneath all that stuff. And so it's not being formed today. But yet, how did all that huge deposits of oil get there? We find huge fossil beds, and sometimes they call them fossil bonanzas. This, like Dinosaur National Park, has just hundreds of thousands of dinosaur bones all in one place like that. And so they were going to require a rapid and massive scale burial. And you don't see these things forming today. No evidence of that kind of thing happening today. Ocean fossils on the mountaintops. I talked about this. Not on just some places, but all continents, you see evidence of ocean fossils on the mountaintops like this. Tropical plants at the North and South Pole. And now this might be evidence of, perhaps some kind of canopy and so forth. Now, I don't think that the canopy can explain where all the water came from, but a vapor canopy has some attractive things about it to explain some of this business right here, tropical plants at the North and South Pole. The way the scientists explain this, the evolutionists explain this, is they say there must have been a pole shift. That at some point the North and South Pole were where the equator is, and the Earth must have shifted some kind of way. I don't know how to explain all that stuff, but that's what they have to do in order to be able to explain this. A canopy would do very nicely to explain a pre-flood environment like this. Upright tree fossils spanning stratas of going through different rock layers. Here's a picture of one just to give you an example. So here's this tree turned into a rock like this, and yet you see all these different layers. And so, I mean, if these layers are formed over millions and millions of years, each layer being an error or whatever, how do you get this tree to stand upright for millions of years while it waits patiently for all these layers to kind of build up around it and finally turn it into a fossil? It's not going to. It's going to lay down horizontally, but yet here it is vertical in the fossil record. It had to happen quickly. Each one of these layers had to be laid down over a short period of time in order to be able to form something like this. Now, this is something common throughout the whole world. It's very interesting. If you look at these rivers, like the Nile River Basin and the Delta, Mississippi River Delta and so forth, you see these little rivers in these huge river basins. And it's common throughout the whole world. You got these tiny little rivers in these huge basins like this, and of course that's supposed to be, the river cut that basin. Well, that means the river had to be way, way bigger at some point in order to be able to cut those huge basins in. So you've got these underfit rivers flowing in these huge valleys or these river basins, and another evidence that at some point in time there must have been huge amounts of runoff in order to be able to form those basins like that. And basically you got a little tiny river now that's kind of following the path of least resistance to get through that. Now, a key argument against creationists is the fact that the fossils are sorted into layers, and that supposedly represents the age of the different, or the sequence of evolutionary history of the world. The lower the fossil layer, the older the fossils and so forth, and the higher level animals, the ones that have evolved to a much higher state, are at the higher layers and so forth. And so why do we see the fossils sorted into layers like this? You see at the very bottom, you see typically things like clams and so forth. And in this layer you might find these types of animals, amphibians and so forth. And in this layer you might find dinosaurs. In this layer you might find, human bones up here at the top and birds at the very top and so forth. And so this is supposed to represent, some sort of evolutionary history of the world and so forth in these layers. So, how do you explain this? I mean, if you're a creationist and you think, well, all this stuff was created by God and this is all laid down by a global worldwide flood, well, I mean, you sort them out by things like habitat. Some animals, it's where they lived. Now, some animals live at the bottom of the ocean. These clams lived at the bottom of the ocean, and so they would be naturally on the bottom like that. You can sort them out by intelligence. I mean, the ones that are smart enough to run to the high hills, they're going to get buried last. And so a higher level evolutionary animal is going to get on top because he's going to either tread water for a long period of time or climb up to the top of a tree or whatever. So intelligence is going to play a factor into this. Their mobility, whether they can move or not. A clam can't move, so he couldn't flee to high ground like that. And so he's going to get buried there on the bottom. And these other animals that are a little smarter or are able to fly or run or float and so forth, their mobility is going to let them do that. And then finally, density is going to play a role in this. The heavier, more dense animals are going to be, down in the bottom layers, and the lighter weight animals are going to be closer to the top and so forth. And so any number of different explanations for how you sort this out, short of actually being there and watching it all happen, which none of us were. Neither were they. Now, and fossils are not being formed slowly, or they're not formed slowly, I should say, but quickly, and only in a very rapid sort of burial environment. You can't take a fossil and expect it to form. Suppose, for example, an animal dies out here on the plain somewhere and lays down and it's sitting there. What happens to that animal? Well, he begins to decompose. You know, the carrion and so forth, the ravens and so forth begin to eat away at that animal. You know, whatever is left of that animal is not going to get fossilized. It's going to just decompose and rot and turn to dust and blow away. There won't be a fossil like that. In order to create a nice preserved imprint of a fossil, particularly with the fleshy tissues like we find in a lot of fossils and things like that, you find even fossils of plant leaves and so forth and things like that. And so they didn't have time to decay like that. That implies a very rapid burial at a very high amount of pressure. And so some would have had to have been buried in less than a minute. And if they were never buried, they would never fossilize. And so you've got to bury these things like that. More flood evidences. We talked about the origin of civilization. Where was the origin of civilization? Somewhere over in the Middle East, right? Well, close to where the ark landed. It'd be a good spot for origin of civilization to occur, because that's indeed where Noah and his family would have begun to spread out from there. Archaeology. Anytime we find pottery and evidence of agriculture and domestication and all that kind of stuff, all these things date to less than 10,000 years ago. Nothing older than that. And written history only appears ever about 5,000 years ago. We talked about this that one night. The oldest living trees are only about 4,000 some odd years old. And what happened about 4,400 years ago? A global worldwide flood that destroyed everything. So the only trees we're going to find, if they never die, they're going to be about 4,400 years old, because they'd have to start over again. And then finally, you've got population growth statistics. If you look at just the growth of population from the year 1600 to the year 2000 over the last, see an incredible increase in population growth here. And it's, explainable by any number. I mean, basically, all you got to have is just, 2.2 children being born to each family, and you're going to get increases in population, and it's going to exponentially increase. And that's the exponential curve that happens like that. Well, if humans were supposed to have been around for the last 2 million years, this is what that chart would look like. It'd be almost nobody for the first 2 million years, and then all of a sudden, boom, it just shoot up, because that's that last 400 years right there out of 2 million like that. And so the evidence of the way population growth works doesn't fit either. Now, there's another criticism of the ark. Of the flood, and that is, how did Noah get all those animals on the ark, right? I mean, if that's supposed to represent all of life, how did Noah get how did Noah get all those animals on the ark? So let's see. Let's look at the specifications for the ark. We'll go back to the Bible again. God tells Noah in Genesis 6:14, "Make yourself an ark of gopher wood, and make rooms in the ark, and cover it inside and outside with pitch. And this is how you shall make it. The length of the ark shall be 300 cubits, its width 50 cubits, and its height 30 cubits. You shall make a window for the ark, and you shall finish it to a cubit from above, and set the door of the ark in its side. And you shall make it with lower, second, and third decks." That's all Noah needed to figure out how to build that ark. I mean, he may have started a couple of times. He had 120 years, so he may have been able to make a few mistakes, but this is what we would expect Noah to do. And it was gopher wood. We don't know what gopher wood is today, but that's the biblical word for it. It was waterproofed by pitch inside and out. And there's a lot of spiritual implications of all that. That's another sermon. Anyway, it's 450 feet long. That's about 300 cubits. If a cubit is the length of a man's elbow to his tip of the finger, that would be about 18 inches. 450 feet long would be the length of it. 75 feet wide and 45 feet tall. This is a fairly odd-looking boat. It's a box, basically. Real long and interesting, though. But The ideal ratio of a ship building today, I mean, they've been building ships, ocean seaworthy type vessels for some time now. The ships they build today are considerably larger than that ark right now. I mean, the giant ships that they are able to build. But it's interesting, the ratio of how they're built is similar to the way that ark was built, okay? And they know the ratio of its width, I mean, its breadth to its length and its drafts and all that kind of stuff needs to be a particular type of ratio in order for it to be a seaworthy vessel. And we'd expect to find, if God's the designer of this ark, we'd expect it to be an ideal ratio, right? Because He does everything perfectly. Well, turns out they build the current modern ships in the same ratios that they built the ark back then, that the ark was specified for. And so indeed it is the ideal ratio. Now here's an artist rendering of that ark. It's a little video picture. I'll let you look at that. But it's got 3 decks. Notice it's got a full-length window across its entire top, like that, finished to within 2 cubits above. That's like they call that a clerestory window. And its gross tonnage would be, that's the amount of cargo that you can put on that, 13,960 tons that you could put on such an ark like that. That's equivalent to 522 railroad box cars. Now these, excuse me. There's a science of transportation. They understand, how many. Matter of fact, they measure things by how much you can put on a boxcar. That's how they figure shipping and so forth. By how much you can put on a boxcar, particularly when it comes to animals. I mean, they ship cattle and sheep and all kinds of animals and so forth on boxcars, and they know exactly how many sheep you can fit on a boxcar like that. And so, let's take a look at what was on that ark and see if it was enough to fit in 522 railroad boxcars. So what was on the ark? What was its cargo? Well, it was the genetic material of life, right? I mean, the reason God put all the animals and Noah and his family, everything on the ark is because He wanted to preserve life so that it could start up again. And about 60% of the animals, by the way, live in the water. There's no need to put those animals on the ark. They're going to do fine in the water. The ones that do survive like that, they're going to do fine. And of the remaining critters, 70% of them are insects, little tiny creatures and so forth. You don't have to walk them up 2 by 2 to get on the ark. They can do fine on their own. They can float on vegetation mats. They can ride. They can float in the water. They'll make it just fine. So you don't have to worry about the insects or the animals that live in the sea. And so the only animals you got to put on the ark are those, or the rest of those, whatever percentage that comes out to be, the mammals and air-breathing type animals. In Genesis 7:2 and 3, God tells Noah what he is to bring on that ark. He says, "You shall take with you 7 of each of every clean animal, male and its female, 2 each of the animals that are unclean, a male and his female, also 7 each of the birds of the air, male and female, to keep the species alive on the face of the earth." That's the purpose, to keep, so he can preserve these animals like this. He's going to save that. And in Genesis 7:14 it says, "They and every beast after its kind, all cattle after their kind, every creeping thing that creeps on the earth after its kind, and every bird after its kind." See, the kinds, according to God, are like the species that we talk about. And every bird of every sort in there. And so you've got to put a lot of different animals on there. And then he goes on in verse 22, he says, "And all in whose nostrils was the breath of the Spirit of life, all that was on the dry land died." So basically God is saying that the ones that died are the ones that were the air breathing. Those are the ones that Noah needed to put on the ark. And so insects don't breathe air through their nostrils. They didn't need to come. So God had the specifications for what kind of animals, the air breathing type animals. So no insects and no fish on that ark. And so what'd you have? You had mammals, you had reptiles, you had birds, you had some dinosaurs, okay? Not big ones. I mean, no need to put a giant brontosaurus on there. You can put a little teenager on there, one that hadn't grown up much. That would make more sense anyway. It would, you'd have a better chance of of reproducing and fending off things like that as a little teenager. So amphibians would be on that ark, frogs and stuff like that. 8 people and all the food for the animals and the people.
Can I ask a question right there?
Yes.
Okay. Why does it necessarily destroy everything on the face of the earth except for 8 people? Something,
Judgment.
So something sinister must have happened to human, right?
Yeah, and you read Genesis chapter 6, there was bad stuff going on.
God in a man, the doors of men had something to do with it.
One of the few places where it says God was sorry that he made man. Because there was nothing but evil coming out. And man had infected basically everything on the earth, and Noah was the only righteous man he could find, and so he saved Noah and his family. It's a picture of judgment. And so when we talk about the flood and so forth, that's how you get into witnessing about sin and judgment and so forth, and the soon coming judgment of God. And the salvation that's provided. There's only one place in that ark, and that's where Jesus is. We need to take refuge in Jesus. So the ark is a picture of Christ. Genesis 6:21 says, "And you shall take for yourself," this is talking about the food, "you shall take for yourself all food that is eaten, and you shall gather it to yourself, and it shall be food for you and for them." So what kind of food, by the way? Well, would he have to bring some meat on there for all these meat-eating animals?
No.
Why not?
They didn't eat meat.
They didn't eat meat, did they? As a matter of fact, they didn't. It says in Genesis chapter 1:30, it says, "And to every beast of the earth," this is God after his creation, he's telling them, that he's provided for them, "to every bird of the air and to everything that creeps on the earth in which there is life, I have given" what? Every green herb. They were vegetarians. They didn't eat meat for food, and it was so. So everything were vegetarians. And so it wasn't until post-flood that God ordained and sanctioned the eating of meat and so forth, and he did that in Genesis 9:6. We'll see that, I think, in just a minute here, or 9:3, I should say. So before we get into that, let's talk. We're talking about whether the ark was big enough. We're trying to get a catalog of all the things that had to go in the ark, rather. John Woodmarappy did this chart right here. So I really don't know how he got these numbers, but I found it interesting. He said that of all the species, in order to cover all the mammals, you had to get at least 7,428 different species types. The birds would be 4,602. Reptiles would be 3,724. The total number of species then would be 15,754. And not considering the fact that some of them you got to bring 7 on, I'm ignoring that. But just forgive me for ignoring that part, because I don't know which ones are clean and which ones are not in that list. And so it's going to be more than this, but not that much more. You got to double that if you keep male and female in there. So 31,508 animals on the ark. And if you figure that the average size of an animal was about the size of a sheep, I think that would be close, because you got a lot of small ones and you got a lot of big ones, and you're not going to get the old big ones. Like a couple of elephants, again, you get the teenagers. You don't get the great big ones and stuff like that. And so the capacity of that ark at 522 boxcars, I said it was, taking an average size of a sheep. They know exactly how many sheep can go in there. You can actually get 125,000 sheep on an ark of that size, and so you've got plenty of room over and above the 31,000 necessary right here. So there's plenty of capacity on that ark to put all these animals like that. And so that probably raises a few other questions. For example, how did Noah persuade all these animals to get on that ark? Some of them might be some pretty ornery creatures like that, trying to get them on that ark like that. Weren't some of them vicious? Well, again, they're not meat eaters, and so I think they're okay. But you know what? There's a principle here that we don't need to forget, that it's not all up to Noah. I mean, God has given Noah a lot of instructions, and God's the one that's going to bring the rain. God can do miracles. God's in control of everything, and so there are some few things that he has a role in this story too. And in fact, we're going to see this in Genesis 7:7-9. It says, "So Noah with his sons, his wife, and his sons' wives went into the ark because of the waters of the flood." So they're in the ark, and then it says, "Of the clean animals and animals that are unclean, the birds of every creeping thing, 2 by 2 They, the animals, went into the ark to Noah. Noah's already in the ark. He didn't have to go get all those animals in there. Guess what? God paraded them all up that ramp and brought them into that ark. Okay? And so Noah didn't have to go get all those. Noah just had to tend for them while they were in there. Male and female as God had commanded Noah. So God helped out. Huh?
It took 7 days to load the ark because we say it took 7 days to load the ark. The Bible implies it's 7 days.
Yeah, exactly. Now, I don't know whether Noah did some preliminary work, going out and doing some things. Certainly he was busy during those last few days. So that raises another question, by the way. How did Noah build such a big boat out of wood, gopher wood? I mean, the ships they build today are steel ships and so forth. How do you build a big wood, boat like that out of wood? He had such a small family. How did such 8 people? And I don't know how much the help the wives gave into that, but Noah and his 3 sons, how did they build this ark? Well, Noah, I'm sure, was a rich man, okay? And he had 125 years to do this. And he probably hired some people, okay, to help him do this. Now, granted, they're not going to survive, but Noah's preaching, and what better place to preach than to your employees and so forth. And so he had a group of hired hands is building this ark, and so, it's not really a boat either, by the way. I mean, it's not like you've got to, this is not, I mean, it wouldn't go anywhere. He just had to float. It's just a box. It's a very simple structure. And so, a lot of things could explain that as far as how Noah could build that out. And how could Noah care for all those animals? Well, they're probably pretty easy to care for, actually. I have witnessed this amongst my pets. When we go on a trip, like when we moved from Atlanta to Memphis, I took my dog and my cats and so forth, and we made this journey. And I noticed how my dog and my cats and everything, they were very lethargic during the trip. And it's because, they may have got a little motion sickness or whatever, and they didn't eat anything. I didn't have to feed them anything. I didn't have to make sure they went to the bathroom because they weren't eating anything, they weren't doing anything. And so probably some of that same stuff is going on with these animals in there. So they probably hibernated or slept during that period of time. It could have been a supernatural thing. But God did tell them to bring some food on there. I don't know whether it was to take care for them when they got off the ark or so they could eat while they were on the ark or whatever. But he and his family probably had no problem getting on the, taking care of those animals in that ark. Now, what about all the smell and the heat buildup in that ark? Well, if they're not eating much, they're not producing that much smell, but this wasn't going to be a nice cruise they went on. And God was gracious enough to tell them to build that window across the entire stop, so I'm sure that off the top of that ship, so I'm sure that Noah's rooms were up at the top, close to where the ventilation was. So, and of course that window answers the question about the illumination. How did you get illumination inside that ark? So, another question, how did the ark withstand all those violent waters, and everything during the flood? Well, let me ask you a question. Where do you find most of the waves? Out there in the middle of the ocean or close to the shore? Close to the shore, right? Where was the shore? There wasn't one. They're in the middle of the ocean no matter where they are because the water's covering the entire earth. And so it's not like they're in violent waters like that with there. And so most of these waves that you would find would not be like the one you see here in that thing. And besides, the ark was certainly capable of withstanding that in the way it was constructed like that. So, another question. What was it like after the flood when Noah stepped off that ark and saw the world post-flood for the first time? I imagine that it was a pretty stark, dramatic picture that was out there. I mean, you've got a world that's been scraped clean of all vegetation that was used to be a very lush environment. And so this place looks like Mars when he gets off there. You got a lot of changes in the climate occurring after the flood. Genesis 8:22 speaks of this. It says, while the earth remains, this is God talking, seed time and harvest, cold and heat, winter and summer, and day and night shall not cease. And so God's not talked about it being cold and hot before that. So I think a lot of these climate changes that we had, and now today started post-flood like that. And so God's saying, You know, you're going to get a lot of cold and heat and winter and summer and day and night and all that. That's not going to cease like that from now on. It's going to be like that. Which perhaps is another little indication of a canopy or whatever. You got a very different animal culture after that, because in Genesis 9:3, this is that reference right here to eating meat. Every moving thing that lives shall be food for you. Moving thing. Plants don't move, okay? These are animals here. Every animal shall be food for you. I have given you all things, even as the green herbs. That was the original deal. You could be a vegetarian, now you can eat meat. And so now the relationship between man and animal changes dramatically, okay? They're no longer your best friend, okay? Because now you're going to be hunting them for food. So man becomes hunter. Many of the animals become hunters and the hunted and so forth. And so red and tooth and claw becomes the common thing in the world. And so animals will fear man and so forth. Now, you're also going to have an ice age after the flood. I think we'll talk about that in a couple of weeks when I talk about dinosaurs, because we want to talk about the woolly mammoths and so forth too. But that basically, ice age comes about because of the warm oceans. You get a lot of evaporation. You got cool summers because of all the volcanic ashes and so forth in the atmosphere. The sun's not able to reach the earth as well. And so combination of lots of moisture coming out of the warm oceans, dropping onto the cool summers where it won't melt so much, snowing a lot and so forth. That's a perfect conditions for an ice age like that. So explanation for an ice age like that. Drastic climate changes are going to lead to the extinction of some of the animals, dinosaurs in particular. We don't see them today. Okay, so they're going to go extinct as a result of that. And of course the question is, did everything die that was not on the ark? Well, many of the fish survived easily, no problem there. The insects and seeds probably lived on in floating vegetation mats, and so the world can begin to repopulate all the plants, plant life and so forth, and trees can begin to sprout up again. And what did they eat after the flood? I mean, if the world's been wiped clean, where's all your what you're going to eat? Well, I think Noah probably brought enough food to get started with, and perhaps that's one of the reasons why God said put 7 of the clean animals on there, because you're going to need to eat some stuff here for meat afterwards. And so they probably ate some of those animals that were on the ark. There's probably carrion out there on the land from animals that and of course they can fish. Perhaps many fish were flopping around out there on the dry land afterwards, and they could eat those. And men probably lived like Stone Age men in caves for hundreds of years because there's just not that much. I mean, it was a great civilization prior to the flood, and afterwards, they're basically having to start over again like a Stone Age. And so the book of Job describes an ice age and a Stone Age type of citizens. We'll read from that in a couple of weeks here if we get a chance. Now, here's the question everybody always asks. Where did all that water come from? How do you cover an entire earth of upwards of the entire mountains and so forth? Genesis 7:11 says, in the 600th year of Noah's life, in the 2nd month, we read this already, all the fountains of the great deep were broken up, and the windows of heaven were open. Now the great deep in this verse, I don't think means the bottom of the oceans. I think it means something below the mantles of the earth. We'll see about that in just a minute here. So if that's a curious question, where did all the water come from? Another question would be, okay, well, if it's covering the entire earth, where did it all go to? I mean, how do you get rid of all that water? If it recedes off the continents, there's no hole for it to go into, so how do you get rid of all that water? Well, so here's a picture. During the flood, in day 150 of the flood, back when the waters had reached their highest point, before they began to recede, you've got the future continents, which are all covered like this, and the future ocean basins like this. And so you get vertical motion of the continents. You got mountains coming up, mountains that used to be maybe maximum, 1,000 feet or so. now going up to much higher heights. Everest, 29,000 feet and so forth. So you get mountains rising up. That means the other land masses have got to come down, because when you push something up, something else has got to come down. And so you get a pocket over here for the oceans to recede off these continents during all this massive continent forming and so forth happening during that second half of the flood like that. And so a lot of volcanic, huge cataclysmic events going on, geologically speaking. So we go back to this geology idea, to all these layers, and we look at a model that will explain all this sedimentation, all this mountain building, the Grand Canyon. How do you explain that? How do you explain all the fossils? And how do you explain all the layer folding that we saw earlier? And we get into this idea of catastrophic plate tectonics. Now, if you look at a map of the world, and if you were able to see the topography of the underneath the oceans, you would see these great oceanic, mid-Atlantic oceanic ridge here underneath the water, where it's like this mountain range completely submerged under the water. So you get this ridge that looks like this. Over in the Pacific, there's another ridge. Over here in the Indian Ocean, there's a little bit smaller ridge. So you get these ridges at the bottom of the ocean. So what's the deal with these ridges like this? Well, basically, catastrophic plate tectonics is a high-speed, or basically a sped-up version of standard plate tectonics. The continents are always moving and so forth, and that's why we have earthquakes, because they come over one another, and as they scrape and rub and move and so forth, we get earthquakes and things like that. And all these movements are very, very slow, and so they assume they've been going slow all this time. And yet there's no really reason to assume that. The main argument for plate tectonics is that the existing continents fit so well together. You've got this heel of Africa fitting in with this area and everything, so you kind of get this nice fit of the continents. And so perhaps those continents were together at one point. And maybe they separated at one point. And of course, talking about this 48,000 mile long mountain range on the ocean floor, what caused that? The discovery of this range was only since the 1950s. And so this oceanic rift, they call it, is a remnant, I'm going to claim, of the splitting continents. The continents splitting apart. That's the oceans, the fountains of the great deep coming up. As a matter of fact, this is the model. This is not my model. Did any of you see a book out there that we were selling on the, what was it called? The book we used to sell in the Creation Science. We had a few left, and they were putting them out there on the table. Anyway, it was called, I'll think of it later. But anyway, this model came out of that book. This scientist that came, this creation scientist that came up with this idea right here. And a lot of the creation scientists have very similar models to this, but I happen to like this one. And so basically, you've got this idea underneath the mantle of the earth, you've got this subterranean water here that's pre-flood, all about 10 miles thick of water underneath all these continents and so forth. And you've got, pre-flood mountains that aren't so big, maybe maximum 800,000 feet tall and so forth. And so you get all these continents and so forth. And the pre-flood seas were rather small. They didn't cover 2/3 of the earth like they do today. Okay, and this cap of plate right here is covering all that water right there, and so it's sealed up. And so at some point it begins to rupture, and all this water is going to begin to spew out like a fountain. Okay. And all the continents are pressing down on that water, so it's pressing it out of this crack, and so it's spewing out at very high speeds, and going to do some interesting things. So here's the rupture phase of this fountains of the great deep, and so this ridge, as it begins to spread apart like this, you've got these continents that are fitting together, and now they begin to separate because this ridge right here, this is the crack in the Earth's crust that's going to allow all this subterranean water to start coming up out of there. And by the way, the subterranean water fits with some of the verses in the book of Genesis, as far as God having the waters below the firmament and the waters above the firmament and so forth. Kind of fits with that idea as well. And so North and South America start moving toward the west, and Europe and Africa start moving toward the east. And so these giant plates, these giant continental-sized plates, are lubricated by all the water underneath. There's really no friction for them to keep them from moving. And so as this water starts coming out, it starts pressing them out, and they start moving. And by the way, this is the way that would break. So you get these. This would be the picture of the two continents. Here's Africa, and here's the United States, and so forth. And here's the subterranean water, and there's the rift. Think of a spring on top of this concrete block right here with a couple of bricks sitting on top of the spring, and the spring is under tension like this. And so as you separate these two bricks like this, what's going to happen to that spring? Well, if it's under tension, it's going to buckle up like this. And so that's the same thing we'd expect to happen, with this the magma underneath the earth like this. As the water splits up and these continents start to separate, the pressure that it's under is going to be released, and it's going to buckle up. And so that forms the oceanic rift, that ridge, that giant mountain range that you see underneath the water in the oceans today. And so as the water spews up, there it is. And so here's the depiction of the forces of this rift that comes up. And so here are these continents lubricated by the water down here, moving off, perhaps 40 miles an hour in this direction and 40 miles an hour in this direction, like this. And so you got these giant continents moving off like this.
All this is done at about a year, is that correct?
All this happens during sometime in that flood year, exactly. Well, it's to start the flood year, and then as it continues, it will end up playing a role at the end of the flood as well, so to give the water some place to go when you start getting that vertical movement. Now, here's an interesting picture that kind of gives you an idea. This is called the Great Unconformity. You get these layers of rock like this that get sheared off, and then you get additional layers put on top. Now, the scientists call this the Great Unconformity, and the reason I'll show you a real picture of it here in just a minute. The reason they call it an unconformity is because it doesn't conform to anything that they can understand. And so I don't know why it's sheared off like this, but a good explanation for this would be, the continents shearing off, and these layers right here would be creation week layers that are created when God's moving all the continents around. Yes?
You said that the water is pretty level like the middle of the ocean, the continents breaking apart, these fountains coming up. Would that have created gigantic waves?
Yeah, in certain areas, maybe not where Noah was, but once that water reaches Noah and starts raising that ark up, I think he's probably okay. There's going to be some billows in the seas, but you're not going to get giant breaking waves because there's no shores at that point once the ark is lifted up off the earth. Because this is happening over in the middle of the Atlantic, or that rift is, and Noah's over there, close to the Garden of Eden and Mesopotamia and all that kind of stuff. So he's pretty far away from the major part of that problem until the
major rift there in the south of the Indian Ocean.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, so what's going to happen then is, here's the point I wanted to make. I'm going to show you a picture here. This layer below here has this layer of quartzite, which is quartz type material right here. This would, and then when it gets sheared off, there's a block stuck right in the middle of this layer. Let me show it to you. It's a bad picture, but here's a man. This is the quartzite square block like this, and you can see how the flow of the rocks kind of flow around this thing. They kind of move up over it and flow up underneath it and so forth. And so this quartzite layer gets sheared off, brought along by all the flows that are being laid down by water, and finally settles down into this spot right here. The scientists can't explain the existence of this quartzite block in the middle of these layers if they got laid down over millions of years. That had to be a cataclysmic event that positioned that dude right there where you see it. So here's another picture of the Great Unconformity coming up here in just a minute here. Well, I'll show you a picture of it in just a minute. Actually, I thought I had it there, but I don't. So let me ask you this. Was the Grand Canyon built by a little water over a long period of time or a lot of water over a short period of time? Yeah, a lot of water over a short period of time. So here's the Grand Canyon. Folks, I am sorry, it is 7:30. Do you want me to go on, or you want me to?
Go on.
Okay. If you need to leave, leave. I'm going to try to move quickly here. Anyway, the theory is that the canyon was formed, because this would be way after the end of the flood. The canyon is there, all those layers of the canyon are there during the flood year, and then the canyon itself is formed much later, maybe even 400 years or so later, when it gets carved out and exposes all these layers of the rock and so forth. And so the theory is that here's the Grand Canyon, by the way, and here's the Four Corners area of New Mexico, Colorado, Utah, and Arizona. And so the theory is that right up here at the beginning of the Grand Canyon, where the Colorado River enters this thing, you had a great dam breach right here. So this dam is holding back all these lakes that are after the flood, left by the water from the flood like this. And all of a sudden the dam breaches right here and the lakes rush in and carve out this canyon, and now today the lakes aren't there. But you can see, if you walk around this profile right here, they've actually done it. You can find an old lake, edge of a lake across much of this area. So there's evidence that there used to be Great Lakes right there. So the whole canyon gets gouged out. This is a picture of the canyon. You can see just by the way, here's the river. So do you think that little tiny river carved out all this business right here? No way. It had to be something much more massive than that. So here's a picture from the aerial view showing the Grand Canyon. You see how the snow line kind of tells the story of where the canyon right here. This is all snow, and then there's the canyon right there with the little river caught at the bottom of this thing. Now here, and of course the Kaibab uplift is all right here, is what they call that. Now, let me ask you a question. How can water flow uphill in order to cut a mountain out? Well, it doesn't. It doesn't do that, because the top of this canyon is at about a 6,000 foot elevation, and yet the Colorado enters the canyon at a 2,800 foot elevation. So somehow or another, according to their theory, that river would have to come up here and start cutting, and finally work it all the way down. And so that would not be the appropriate picture to think of right here. And then here's an aerial view of this canyon. The Colorado River enters the canyon at this point at 2,800 feet, flows through the canyon in this direction, and at this point, the rim of the canyon is at 6,900 feet. That's over a mile deep, 5,280 feet being a mile. So that canyon is vast there. And so that tells the picture of how a dam break would be much easier to explain the existence of that canyon than would the river carving that over millions of years. And of course, if you go to the Grand Canyon and stand at the edge, that's the first thing the park ranger tells you. Well, this canyon was formed over millions and millions of years by that little river you see down there. And you're going, yeah, right. I forget what was up there when I skipped over that. Let me see if I can go to the previous page here. I think I can, yeah. All right, there we go. All right, so again, these layers down below here at the Great Unconformity, here's the bottom of the Grand Canyon like this. What forms all these layers like this, and why do you get this sharp knife edge sort of angle like this? Well, during the creation week, you get these layers built when God moves all the continents around and separates the waters from the waters and does all that kind of stuff during the first 6 days of creation. And then during the flood, you get all these layers being folded because the continents are moving. They crash into each other, fold up layers like this to create the giant mountain ranges and so forth. So you get all this buckling as the continents crash into each other, moving at 40 miles an hour or whatever. And so now what used to be flat becomes angled up like this. And then during the runoff of the flood, or perhaps even during the transgression of the flood, you get this surface erosion, from the water scouring the top of this clean like this. And then during the runoff, you get new horizontal layers laid on top of that during that flood. Now, do we have anything comparable that we've actually seen and witnessed? Well, as a matter of fact, in 1980, Mount St. Helens exploded on May 18th. And here's a picture of the mountain prior to the explosion. You can see a little bit of smoke coming out of the top of it, and the side of this mountain was bulging out about 50 feet, increasing each day like a balloon. Okay, so they knew something big was about to happen, but they didn't know quite how big. Here, this is a picture from the observatory about 10 miles away. This photographer taking this picture of this thing, not knowing what's going to happen. In the next second, he takes another frame, and all of a sudden, the side of this mountain starts falling down here. sliding down the side of the mountain. The volcano was then uncorked, and so you see this stuff starting to spew out of the top of it right here. The side of the mountain is disappearing, and you can see all these pyroclastic flows or explosions coming up. You get a huge debris avalanche, about a half mile of cubic rock gets exploded and thrown out into the atmosphere and so forth. The explosion grows at incredible speeds. At this point, if I was that photographer, I'd be hightailing out of there at this point. And then finally you get this direct blast, which was equivalent to about 20 million tons of TNT, a total of 400 million tons of explosives coming out there. And it's all superheated ash and steam moving at hundreds of miles an hour. By the way, the photographer survived. That's why we got those pictures right there. I think he scurried into a building or something like that. But the canyons were formed in 5 months. There were canyons formed in that Mount St. Helens blast. They were formed in just 5 months. The Badlands that were formed during that part of the time were formed in just 5 days. The layered strata that we see, there's a canyon in there that got carved out, and then the layered strata was exposed. All that layered strata for that, it's a kind of a scale of the Grand Canyon to about 1/20th scale. All that layered strata was formed in 3 hours, and materials like the Mesquite sandstone and so forth from the Grand Canyon, you could see similar evidences of that. You got upright sinking logs that were formed in bog layers and so forth in just 10 years, so you get the same evidence of these vertical upright trees inside what would eventually become fossilized trees like that. And so 150 square miles of forest was toppled in just 6 minutes. These are trees. I mean, that's not just twigs. These are everything you see here about this long is a giant tree like that. They look like matchsticks down there. Here's another picture, a little bit closer up picture of them. Now, just to give you a little bit of scale of how massive this was and what size these trees are, there's a river 20 miles away with all the trees flowing underneath that river. You can see the bridge. That bridge is going to get torn down here in just a minute here. But yet, look at this little toy right here. That's a regular construction vehicle, one of those giant dump trucks and everything. And so you can see the size of the logs that moved all those little, they got picked up and moved around like little toys like that from that flow of trees and so forth from that thing. And they're hauling them away right here. Here the trees are all hauling away. And then Spirit Lake makes a mat, floating vegetation mat, where the bark and so forth and trees form peat and so forth, just like you would expect to find in the oil fields. The trees fell down to the bottom. You got a little mini Grand Canyon. All of this was carved out in a matter of, laid down in a matter of hours and carved out several days later by dam breaches. It was exactly like that, like a dam breach from that canyon. And you've got a rapid recovery of the ecosystem afterwards, by the way. And of course, if you look closely, you can see the stratifications sorted into coarse and fine materials based upon what speed the water was flowing at that particular point in time. The water traveling at different speeds, carrying different particles, and so forth. So that's it. What can we learn from the flood? Well, there was a lot of death and destruction during that flood, wasn't it? Well, it's God's judgment upon sin. And that's the lesson of the flood. And God's salvation from destruction. Both those come from that. And so Revelation 16 says, a great earthquake, a seismos, such as not was on the earth before. The cities and nations fell, every island fled away, and the mountains were not found. That's what's coming. That's the judgment that's coming at some point in time. So tell people about God's judgment and God's salvation in the future here. So if you can't believe in Genesis, you're not going to believe in Revelation, right? Over there. So we need to believe that. Let's pray. Father, thank you for this evening. Thank you for helping us. Thank you for your Son Jesus, who saves us, Father. We ask you to go with us now to our homes and bring us back to worship this Sunday. In Jesus' name we pray. Amen.